Hi, my name's Kate. I'm an Egyptologist, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to spot a good Egyptology book, ancient history book, archaeology book, any of the subjects within that field, but this can also be used to think about any other sort of humanities subject or maybe even other types of academic subjects. This is particularly useful if you are not a student, because if you are a student you should be taught this by your university, but perhaps you're quite a new student and you haven't been taught this yet, or you're a casual reader, somebody who's doing their own reading and research at home. So I hope this really helps. I've got this giant pile of books here on my lap and they keep on threatening to fall down, but we're going to use them as examples of my points here. And so let's get started with the first point, which is who is the author of the book? So every book should have a little biography about the author. If it's a hardback book, it's probably in the dust jacket, which doesn't help if you're in a charity shop or a second-hand shop, or even if you've bought it online and the dust jacket has gone missing. That's the case for this book, which is Mark Lenner's The Complete Pyramids. If that is the case, then look up the author online. Fortunately, most of us have got access to a smartphone, so we can do that even if we are in a shop. So the questions that you should be asking when looking at the biography of an author is, what degrees do they have? Are they relevant for the subject matter? Do they have a job in the field? Have they written relevant books for the field? Now, this is not absolutely necessary. There are people who have got degrees in maybe only slightly related fields, but have gone on to work in and specialise in the subject matter that the book is written about. So it doesn't mean that if they haven't got a specifically relevant degree that they wouldn't be writing a good book. The same, but turned on its head, is people with relevant degrees aren't necessarily able to write good books. So this is not the be all and end all. If they have a relevant job in the field, that hopefully indicates that their institution respects them as somebody who can write well and produce really good quality publications. So the examples I've got in my stack of books here are Mark Lenner. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. I know that he is an archaeologist who has worked for years surveying the Giza Plateau. He's an Egyptologist and an archaeologist, and so I know he is the best person to write a modern book on the Giza pyramids. We've got a book by Toby Wilkinson, who is a prolific writer of Egyptology books. In his biography, it says that he studied Egyptology at Cambridge University and he is a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. So again, the institution, which is world respected and renowned, trusts him to be an excellent Egyptologist. On the other hand, we've got this book by P.H. Newby. I think I picked this up from a charity shop. And then the other day I read the author biography inside. And it turns out that P.H. Newby is not an Egyptologist. He was in the military, I believe. He then joined the BBC and worked there as a controller of Radio 3 and other radio programming, and was managing director of BBC Radio, and is now the chair, well, now as in the date that the book was published, now the chairman of the English Stage Company, and was a novelist. He does not have any degrees in Egyptology. It says he has published more than 20 novels and works of criticism, many which reflect his knowledge of and affection for Egypt. And just before I started filming, I looked up how many books about non-fiction books about Egypt he's written, and the answer is 2, including this one. Doesn't mean that he's not going to be able to write a very good book about ancient Egypt. It just gives you an indication that he doesn't have degrees in Egyptology or a PhD in Egyptology. The majority of books published about ancient Egypt and about other subjects in the ancient history and archaeology field are written by people who have got PhDs, because publishers want to know that those people are experts. This book is old. It's from 1980. So back then, maybe publishers were a little bit less stringent about who published books. But as I said, just because an author doesn't have a PhD in the relevant subject doesn't mean they're not able to write a good book, but it does give you a picture of the background of the person who wrote the book. So continuing on from that, let's talk about publishers. So there are certain publishers who are very prolific in publishing Egyptology books. Thames and Hudson are one. I love their books, particularly their Complete series, as the Complete Pyramids is part of. So has the publisher of the book that you're looking at published more books in that specific academic field? If they have, it may indicate that they have knowledge of Egyptologists, archaeologists, ancient historians, whoever, and may indicate that the person that they've chosen to write a book, or that they've struck a book deal with, struck a contract with, is somebody that they trust will write a good book, somebody that produces high quality work. And if they have got experience in this field, the publisher will hopefully have chosen a very good editor, and anybody else who needs to work on the publication of this book, particularly formatting. I have seen some older published books which have not got great formatting, so hopefully modern publishers with modern technology and experience of other publications in this same or similar field will have formatted the book well. However, just because a publisher hasn't got experience in publishing other books in this specific field doesn't mean that this is a low quality book. The next thing I would look at is the date that the book was published. So most books that you will see on the shelves of a first-hand bookshop like Waterstones are probably quite recently written and published, whereas books that you find in second-hand bookshops are possibly older. So we need to look in the publishing page of the book. So for example, in this book, the Egyptian Myths by Gary J. Shaw, it says that the book is copyright 2014 and first published in the UK in 2014. So this book is 12 years old at this point. Quite recent compared to other books in my collection, which I started collecting many, many years ago. So this book, we would assume, is relatively up to date. Obviously, print books cannot be updated once the final draft has been written. Unless you find out a new piece of information and write it in the book yourself, your book will not be able to be updated as the hard copy that it is, unlike websites, for example, which, can be unreliable for many reasons. But new editions can be published, and you need to read the publishing page to work out whether a new edition is just a reprint. For example, has it been previously only published in hardback and now it's a soft cover, or is it a new edition because it has been revised and updated? So there are certain books, such as textbooks designed for university students, where it will be obvious whether a book is a new edition, and you will know therefore that that book has new content. So this is Renfrew and Barnes' Archaeology Theories, Methods and Practice. This is the 5th edition. I got this probably in 2008 when I started my university degree. So this is obviously designed by the publishers to be updated with new archaeological techniques and methods, new finds, things like that. But this book, being very old now, because I started my degree a long time ago, so this is the 2008 edition, so it was brand new when I got it, but it was first published in 1991, and then they published it with new editions in 96, 2000, 2004 and 2008. So every approximately 4 years they came out with a new edition. If you were going to university this year to study something relating to archaeology, I would not recommend that you get a very old second-hand copy, a very old edition of the book, because the lecturers will expect you to have a more up-to-date version. And this is relevant in a subject that involves new finds. So archaeology is obviously one of those, and then the subjects that are related to archaeology, like ancient history and Egyptology, rely on the evidence that is found through the excavations. And if you've got a book where the evidence is published in the book and the book is old, then the evidence is old. So I was reading the first chapter of this book by Maurice Beerbrier, The Tomb Builders of the Pharaohs. The book was published in 1982, and I happened to buy this book in a bookshop in Luxor. So the book was first published in Egypt in 1989, but it's from 1982. So at this point, this book is 44 years old. And there is a part of the first chapter that I thought was quite surprising until I realised it is relating to the age of the book. So in this first chapter, Beerbrier is talking about corvée labour in ancient Egypt and about the construction of the Giza pyramids. And he's talking about the accommodation that the workers of the Giza pyramids would have lived in. And it says, the archaeologist Flinders Petrie claimed that he had uncovered traces near Giza of the barracks in which such labourers had been housed. And I thought, that sounds like you're referring to quite old information here, that you don't know this for definite at the time that this book was written. And that's because I realised that when Mark Lenner did his excavations on the Giza Plateau, which actually found that the site that Petrie had uncovered was not the actual location of the accommodation of the workers, that was actually probably a craft workshop and storage area. Another area on the Giza Plateau was where those workers were housed. Mark Lenner's work was years after this book was published. So I'm not saying that an older book is not reliable or an older book shouldn't be read, but you need to take into consideration that the evidence that is within the book may not be up to date. So what you should do in that case is check if a more recent excavation has been carried out at that site and read the book about that excavation, or at least go on the university or whoever is funding that excavation or organising that excavation and read the official reports about that excavation so that you have got the most up-to-date information. An older book may not contain all of the currently known information, and it may be disputed in its interpretations by modern archaeologists, Egyptologists, or ancient historians. This is particularly true when taking into consideration that an older generation's interpretations may be biased in a way that is disputed by our biases. So what I mean by that is, in the history of archaeology, the education that people have been trained under, the worldview of those individual archaeologists or by the lecturers that or the archaeologists that trained them, their interpretations of a site and what the ancient civilization was like that lived there may be of their time, may be biased according to the views of the people who were excavating at that time. So, for example, if I were excavating a site from 3,500 years BCE, I might call the finds that I discover at that site using adjectives that discuss those as unique contributions to their own society, their own civilization. Whereas an older Egyptologist from 120 plus years ago might call them primitive. And that is because I have my own interpretations of thinking about an ancient site in according to its own merits, whereas an Egyptologist or archaeologist who was born and brought up during the Victorian times might have interpreted it as in comparison to modern civilization or in comparison to the high point of Egyptian civilization, and therefore if you compare something that is very ancient to the Egyptians and also not as highly developed as the high point of Egyptian material culture makes us familiar with, then maybe those things do seem primitive. That's not the way I would interpret it as. So if you are reading an old archaeological report, even though that may be the best one to read because it is evidenced by the excavations as they were discovered firsthand, it might still be biased according to the people who wrote it at that time. The same as my work is biased by my upbringing, my worldview, my interpretations, and people in 100 years' time might look at my work and think that's not the way I perceive things now, or the way that my culture perceives things now. So you just have to take that into consideration when thinking about how old something is, the publication that you are reading. You can also read reviews that have been left for the book, or at least ratings, to see if the book is generally perceived to be a well-written, high-quality publication. And I would also highly recommend reading the blurb of the book. Don't just read what the blurb says the book is about, but what the book aims to do. So what does it aim to teach you, and in what way does it aim to teach you? You could also read that relevant section of the introduction. It's usually in the sort of second half of the introduction of the book that discusses how the book is written and how it's structured and what it's trying to teach you. You should also take into consideration the type of publication. For example, you've got textbooks which tend to be a brief amount of information on a wide range of subjects that often have very useful things inside. For example, illustrative pictures, but also big text boxes that are an aside to the text but are often very useful to educate you in the many of the basic informations about a particular subject. And you've also got narrative books, which are more of a sort of sit down in your armchair with a cup of tea and read about them, but that are less textbook structured, versus publications of primary evidence, such as excavation reports written by the archaeologist who worked on the site, translations and commentary by the linguist who translated a particular text, or interpretation of particular material culture by a specialist. These are publications on primary evidence, whereas the textbook and the narrative style book are secondary publications, or possibly even tertiary publications. So secondary or tertiary publications are not necessarily less useful than primary publications. Indeed, they can be very useful in putting the evidence into context and helping you to understand it outside of a dry report or a straight translation. if the secondary publications are written by a qualified Egyptologist, ancient historian, or archaeologist, they should have read the primary publications about the evidence that they are referring to. So if the book is well written, you shouldn't necessarily need to read the primary publications. These secondary publications are very useful because they present, contextualise, discuss, interpret this primary evidence in a very interesting narrative. And they use their training, education, and skills that they have developed throughout their degrees and experience of working in the field to be able to make sure that they are writing a high quality publication about not just the evidence but about its wider implications in the field. However, these secondary publications rarely have the space to go into detail about primary evidence, to present a detailed analysis and interpretation of this evidence. This is where the primary publications come in. So it depends on who you are as a user of these publications. Secondary publications should be ample for casual readers and even students and people who have graduated in the field who are just interested in the topic but not actively researching it. However, students and academic researchers or anybody else who is working within the field are expected to read and reference the primary publications, or rather to actually translate or analyse the evidence themselves. So it just depends on who you are, but I like the secondary publications particularly as these are usually purchasable in bookshops or online, whereas the primary publications are usually accessible in academic libraries. So the last idea I'm giving you today is to work out whether the writing style suits you. So I would recommend that you read a couple of paragraphs or pages of the book, particularly from the introduction of a chapter and from the main body of that chapter. This will hopefully give you the chance to read paragraphs where there is description and analysis of primary sources and evidence, and then relevant discussion or argument. Is it well written? Does the writing style suit you? Is it too basic? Is it too academic? Well, there you go. I hope that was helpful. I will be back soon with another video, so please subscribe and I will see you soon. Bye.